Sometimes protection comes disguised as mutual necessity, when two wounded hearts find in union the strength that they no longer possess alone. The September sun burned mercilessly over the small town of Cedar Ridge, turning the earth into fine dust that clung to the sweaty skin of the residents. On the main road, a lone wagon moved slowly, its axles groaning under the weight of few belongings and much despair. Margaret Sullivan held tight to the reins, her blue eyes sweeping the barren landscape in search of something she could call hope. At his feet, two small children slept restlessly on a faded blanket. Timothy was only 5 years old, but he already carried in his eyes that precocious seriousness that the harshness of life impresses on children in the West. Sarah, at the age of 3, still maintained her innocence, but she had cried for anything since they lost their home. Margaret knew she could no longer postpone the inevitable. She needed help, and Cedar Ridge seemed like her last chance before winter set in. The journey from Kansas City had taken 3 weeks, each day more difficult than the last. Money was running out, food too, and the children needed stability. Margaret never imagined that she would find herself in this situation at the age of 28. Married at 16 to James Sullivan, she had built a simple but happy life until typhoid fever took him the previous summer. The debt of medical treatment consumed everything they had, and the landowner had no mercy on a widow with 2 small children. Now, as the wagons swayed through the potholes, Margaret thought of the letters she had sent in response to newspaper advertisements. Lonely men looking for wives to take care of their homes and share the rough life of the frontier. It wasn't love she was looking for. That feeling was buried along with James. It was survival, pure and simple. Thomas Mitchell watched the wagon approach his property through the kitchen window. The 42-year-old man had large, calloused hands from hard work, dark hair already sprinkled with grey strands, and a neatly trimmed beard that couldn't completely hide the scar that cut through his chin on the right side. 3 years earlier, he himself had placed an advertisement in the paper, but no answer had reached that delicately handwritten letter, signed by one Margaret Sullivan. Thomas's farm stretched over several acres of cattle-friendly land, with a solid wooden house that he had built himself with the help of neighbors. It had everything a man could need except company. Her 2 children, 9-year-old Robert and 6-year-old Emily, had grown up a little wild since Eleanor died in childbirth of the 3rd child, who did not survive even a day. Thomas did what he could, but he knew that children needed a female presence, someone who knew how to take care of the little needs that an awkward parent couldn't meet. When he saw Margaret get off the wagon, carrying the little girl as the boy clung to her skirt, Thomas felt something move in her hardened chest. She was younger than she expected, with brown hair tied up in a practical bun and a faded but clean blue dress. It wasn't the beauty that caught her eye, but the determination in her eyes, the way she straightened her shoulders before knocking on her door. The presentations were formal, almost ceremonious. Margaret explained her situation with a candor that impressed Thomas. A resourceless widow, 2 young children, willing to work hard for a roof over her head and protection. Thomas, for his part, went straight to the point. He needed someone to take care of the house and children, offer the marriage on paper to ensure respectability, but without expectations beyond a practical partnership. Their children watched each other with the typical curiosity of children, Timothy hiding behind their mother while Robert and Emily peered through the half-open door. Sarah, brave as ever, took a few staggering steps toward the new faces, which drew an involuntary smile from Emily. Over the simple dinner prepared by Thomas, dried beef, beans, and crusty bread, the practical details were discussed. Margaret would take care of the house, food, clothes, and children. Thomas would continue to run the farm and ensure a livelihood. The marriage would be celebrated by the Justice of the Peace the following week, more out of legal necessity than romance. Neither mentioned love or feelings. It was an agreement, a society based on mutual need. That night, Margaret slept in the guest room with her children, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the new home. The wind shook the loose planks of the roof, and in the distance she could hear the low lowing of the cattle. It was a different world from the one he had known, but at least it was a world where his children would have food on the table and a roof over their heads. Thomas stayed up late, sitting on the porch, smoking his pipe and watching the stars. There was something about this woman that intrigued him. The way she treated the children gently but firmly, how her eyes asked for no pity, only opportunity. Perhaps that practical union could bring something other than convenience to both of them. Perhaps it could bring some peace to two souls, tired of carrying the weight of survival in the Wild West alone. The first few days at the Mitchell farm passed as a careful dance between strangers, learning each other's steps. Margaret would wake up before dawn, accustomed to the routine that life had imposed on her, and find Thomas already in the kitchen, brewing a coffee as strong and black as the scorched earth in the backyard. They moved around the house with the formal courtesy of polite guests, each respecting the other's space. Margaret took over the household chores with quiet efficiency. She washed clothes in the sink behind the house, prepared hearty meals with the simple ingredients from the pantry, and arranged the rooms with a care the house hadn't received in a long time. Thomas watched these changes with a gratitude he didn't know how to express. The curtains were washed and returned to the windows, without the holes he hadn't even noticed. The smell of fresh bread replaced the constant aroma of reheated food and cigarettes that permeated the kitchen. Most importantly, his children began to smile again. Emily, especially, stuck to Margaret from day one. The 6-year-old had lost her mother when she was just 3 years old, and the need for a mother figure was like thirst in the desert, impossible to ignore. She followed Margaret around the house, offering help with touching seriousness, holding the ends of the sheets when hanging on the line or carrying small plates to the table. Robert was more reserved, but Margaret noticed how he cared for his younger brother, Timothy, with a protection that went beyond his years. The two boys struck up a cautious friendship, united by the common experience of growing up too soon, of understanding responsibilities that should still be years ahead. Sarah, with her 3 years of age and determined personality, conquered the entire house in a matter of days. She played with Emily's straw dolls, followed Robert and Timothy on their adventures around the yard, and even managed to get genuine smiles from Thomas when she climbed into his chair during dinner, demanding attention with her innocent chatter. The first week brought small challenges and discoveries. Margaret learned that Thomas liked well-boiled eggs for breakfast, and that Emily had nightmares about wolves. Thomas discovered that Margaret hummed softly while cooking, and that Timothy was fascinated by horses, spending hours watching the animals in the pasture through the fence. In the second week, neighbors began to appear. Martha Coleman, wife of the nearest farmer, arrived one hot afternoon with an apple pie and a thinly disguised curiosity. She was a sturdy, middle-aged woman with strong opinions and a kind heart hidden under a stern facade. Margaret received the visit with the courtesy she had learned since she was a child, serving coffee and thanking her for the pie. Martha surveyed the house with expert eyes, noting the subtle but significant improvements that a female hand had brought. When she left 2 hours later, she seemed satisfied with what she had found. Other visits followed. Reverend Patterson and his wife came to check if the wedding would be held in the church. The local merchant, Samuel Brooks, showed up to meet the new Mrs. Mitchell and offer store credit. Each visit was a discreet test, an assessment of the strange situation of that marriage of convenience that the whole city commented on in whispers. Margaret faced each encounter with the quiet dignity that had become her trademark. He offered no explanation of his previous situation or embarrassment at the practical nature of his arrangement with Thomas. He answered direct questions honestly, but did not stoop to gossip or justification. Thomas admired this silent force. He had known women who bent under the weight of circumstance, but Margaret stood erect like the oaks that grew by the creek, flexible when needed, but never broken. There was a story of pain in his eyes, but also a determination that he recognized as he saw the same thing in the mirror every morning. The wedding date was fast approaching. It would be a simple ceremony at the registry office, with only the children as witnesses. There would be no party or celebration. Both understood that this was not a reason for celebration, but a necessary formality to protect everyone's interests. The night before the wedding, Margaret sat on the porch after the children had fallen asleep. The air was cooler, with a gentle breeze that brought the smell of dry land and grass. Thomas appeared a few minutes later, carrying 2 cups of coffee. They drank in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. Margaret thought of James, of the true love she had lost, and wondered if she was betraying her memory by accepting this union without feeling. Thomas reflected on Eleanor, on the hope that had died with her, and wondered if he was being fair to Margaret by offering only protection when she deserved much more. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had learned that not all conversations needed words, that sometimes the company itself was already a comfort. When they had finished their breakfast, Margaret picked up the cups and wished them a good evening with the same formal courtesy as the last fortnight. That night, they both stayed up longer than usual, each in their own room, looking out the window at the same starry sky and wondering what tomorrow would bring to their lives, intertwined by necessity. The wind blew gently through the trees, carrying with it the last hours of their lives as single individuals, paving the way for a new phase that neither of them knew exactly what it would look like. The full moon bathed the farm in a silver light, illuminating the uncertain future that awaited them on the other side of dawn. The wedding took place on an October morning, when the air was cooler and the leaves of the few trees in the city were beginning to take on golden tones. Margaret put on her best dress, a simple but well-preserved navy blue, and tied her hair in a low bun, decorated with a small brooch that had been her mother's. Thomas wore his Sunday suit, the same one he kept for special occasions and funerals. He was nervous, though he tried to hide it, adjusting his collar several times as they waited in the justice of the peace's room. The 4 children remained silent, feeling the solemnity of the moment without fully understanding its meaning. Judge Patterson was a practical man who had performed dozens of similar marriages, unions based on necessity more than love. He conducted the ceremony with respectful efficiency, without unnecessary flourishes or romantic promises that would ring hollow in that context. Margaret and Thomas exchanged the simple vows required by the law, their voices low but firm. When the judge declared that they were now husband and wife, there was an awkward moment of silence. Thomas hesitated for a second before leaning over and giving Margaret a chaste kiss on the cheek. It was a respectful, almost fraternal gesture that sealed the agreement between them without feigning a passion that did not exist. Lunch after the ceremony was served at the Coleman family home, at the insistence of Martha, who had appointed herself as the unofficial organizer of the event. She prepared a modest but tasty feast of roast chicken, potatoes, and vegetables from her own garden. The children ate with appetite, more relaxed now that the formality had passed. The neighbors in attendance treated the occasion with the appropriate blend of celebration and practicality. There was no music or dancing. Everyone understood that this was not a love party, but the recognition of a sensible partnership. Even so, there was a genuine warmth in the greetings and wishes of happiness they received. The Rev. Patterson pulled Thomas aside before departure, offering advice on the challenges of forming a family with children from previous relationships. His wife discreetly chatted with Margaret about the small details of married life on the border, sharing practical wisdom on how to maintain harmony in a full house. When they returned to the farm in the late afternoon, there was a new formality in the air. They were no longer Thomas Mitchell and Margaret Sullivan sharing a home for convenience. They were now Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, a family before the law and the community. This change in status brought responsibilities and expectations that neither had fully considered. The first few weeks as a married couple brought subtle but significant adjustments. Margaret completely took on the role of mistress of the house, making decisions about purchasing and organization without consulting Thomas first. He, in turn, began discussing with her the plans of the farm, asking for her opinion on issues that he had previously considered exclusively male. The children adapted to the new family dynamics with the flexibility typical of youth. Emily began to call Margaret Mother naturally, without anyone suggesting or correcting it. Robert remained more reserved, but showed growing respect and affection. Timothy and Sarah already considered their new siblings to be a natural part of their lives. The first major test came in November, when a hailstorm destroyed part of the corn crop. Thomas was visibly concerned about the financial implications, calculating and recalculating numbers on the smudged paper on the kitchen table. Margaret watched her anguish in silence for 2 days before approaching. She had saved a small amount of money from her previous life, secret savings that every prudent woman kept for emergencies. Without fanfare or speeches, he placed the coins on the table where Thomas worked and simply said that it could help buy seeds to replant in the spring. Thomas looked at the money, then at Margaret, and something changed in his expression. For the first time since they met, he saw in her not only a convenient partner, but a true companion, someone willing to share not only the benefits, but also the burdens of their union. That night, after the children went to sleep, they talked at length than ever before. Thomas talked about his plans for the farm, his hopes to expand the herd and buy more land. Margaret shared her ideas about a bigger garden, maybe some extra egg chickens they could sell in town. They didn't talk about love or deep feelings, but there was a new intimacy in their words, the intimacy of true partners planning a common future. When Margaret stood up to collect the empty cups, Thomas lightly touched her hand, a small but significant gesture of gratitude and recognition. Winter came early that year, bringing biting winds and snow that covered the Pradera like an endless white sheet. The Mitchell family bonded against the cold, gathered around the fireplace on long nights, the children playing on the floor, while Margaret sewed and Thomas worked on leather or sharpened tools. There were months of close coexistence that revealed the small habits and peculiarities of each one. Margaret found that Thomas had a low, genuine laugh when something really amused him. Thomas noticed that Margaret sang old Irish songs when she thought no one was listening, melancholy melodies that spoke of distant lands and old longings. Winter storms brought moments of enforced intimacy, nights when the wind howled so hard that children huddled in the main room, afraid to sleep alone in their rooms. On these occasions, Margaret and Thomas took turns telling stories or keeping the fire burning, united by their common responsibility to protect and comfort the little ones. When spring finally arrived, melting the snow and revealing the dark, fertile land underneath, something had changed in the Mitchell family dynamic. They were no longer strangers sharing a home out of necessity. They had become a cohesive unit, forged by the shared hardships and small acts of mutual care that had accumulated over the cold months. Spring brought more than melting snow. It brought a quiet transformation that neither had anticipated when they struck their practical agreement months earlier. Margaret watched Thomas working in the fields, preparing the land for the new planting, and she noticed how his movements became familiar, almost comforting. There was a solidity in him that transcended mere physical security. It was the certainty of a man who kept his promises. Thomas, for his part, found himself eagerly waiting for the end of the day, not only for a rest after his hard work, but for the moment when he would return home and see Margaret in the kitchen, the aroma of dinner filling the air, and the children rushing to greet him. It had become a precious ritual, an emotional anchoring I didn't know I needed until I had it. The children flourished in that environment of increasing stability. Emily had become a devoted little helper, learning to sew with Margaret and caring for her younger siblings with touching maturity. Robert took the role of big brother seriously, teaching Timothy about farm animals and protecting Sarah from the dangerous little adventures that her childlike curiosity concocted. In May, Margaret found out she was expecting a baby. The news came on a clear morning when she noticed the signs that every experienced woman recognizes. She sat on the edge of the bed for long minutes, her hands on her still, flat belly, processing the implications of that new life that was growing inside her. When she told Thomas that night, after the children went to bed, he was silent for so long that she began to worry. Finally, he approached and for the first time since they met, touched her face with genuine tenderness. He didn't say grandiose words about love or destiny, but his eyes carried a deep emotion that needed no explanation. The pregnancy brought a new dynamic to the family. Thomas became overly careful, insisting that Margaret not carry excessive weight or overexert herself in household chores. The children were excited by the prospect of a new brother or sister, making elaborate plans about how they would help care for the baby. During the following months, as Margaret's womb grew along with Summer, something fundamental changed between the couple. The respectful silences gave way to more intimate conversations about dreams, fears, and hopes. Thomas spoke of his own father, a stern but fair man who taught him that honor lay in honest work and care for one's family. Margaret shared memories of her childhood in the East, of her mother's lessons about inner strength and dignity. The baby was born one night in September, a year after Margaret arrived at the farm. She was a small but healthy girl, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's determined chin. Thomas held his daughter in his arms for the first time with a bow that moved Margaret to tears. It wasn't just the birth of a child, it was the embodiment of a true family, built on foundations that had turned out to be more solid than either had imagined. They named her Grace. Grace, a name that seemed appropriate for the unexpected blessing that had completed their lives. The other children were enchanted by their little sister, disputing who could hold her or help her at bath time. The house was filled with new joy, the kind of happiness that springs naturally when a family finds its balance. On their first wedding anniversary, Margaret and Thomas met again on the porch, this time with Grace asleep in her mother's arms. The contrast with that first night could not be greater. Where once there had been formal courtesy, there was now mutual comfort. Where there was once uncertainty, there was now confidence. Thomas finally found the courage to say the words that had been growing in his heart for months. It was not a dramatic or poetic statement, but a simple and sincere statement. He loved her. Not only did he respect or appreciate her company, but he truly loved her, the strong woman who had brought light back to her home, who had made her children happy again, who had given birth to the daughter who sealed their union permanently. Margaret smiled when she heard the words because she already knew. She had noticed it in the small gestures, in the way he held her hand when they walked, how his eyes searched for her when she entered a room, how he talked about his plans always including we instead of I. She loved him too, in a way different from the ardent love of her youth with James, but no less true. It was a mature love, built on solid foundations of mutual respect and shared care. The seasons continued their eternal cycle. Other sons arrived, 2 boys who grew strong under the western sun. The farm thrived under the couple's joint care, expanding to include more land and a larger herd. Older children grew up and took on greater responsibilities, forming their own families in the following decades, but always returning to the home where they had learned that true love often arrives disguised as practical necessity. Margaret and Thomas grew old together in that barren, bountiful land, their hands clasped in the afternoons on the porch, watching their grandchildren play in the same backyard where their own children had grown up. They had never regretted the practical marriage that had brought them together, because they had discovered that the best relationships are those built on the solid foundation of mutual need, tempered with respect, strengthened by adversity, and finally blessed by the love that blossoms when least expected. The phrase Thomas had said, that first day, turned out to be prophetic in a way he could never have imagined. His children really needed a gentle hand, and Margaret really needed protection. But what neither of them foresaw was that as they offered each other exactly what they needed, they would discover that they also had much more to give and much more to receive than they had ever dreamed possible. The western sun continued to set each night over the Mitchell farm, bathing in golden light, a family that began as a convenience arrangement and blossomed into one of the most enduring love stories Cedar Ridge had ever witnessed. Because sometimes, when two wounded hearts come together in search of survival only, they find something infinitely more precious, the chance to truly live. If you enjoyed this exciting story of the American Wild West and want to follow more narratives about courage, love, and redemption in the arid lands of the frontier, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Here you will find stories that touch the heart and show how hope can flourish in the most unlikely places, always told with the respect and depth that these human journeys deserve.